Something's a skater. So the more this would hurt me. Luckily, it didn't burn. The amount of attack that this had onto these particles, if it were acidic, would have and if that color meant it was that acidic. The difference between that color and like a frog's skin, if it's like really poisonous, is an amount of secretion if it was putting it on its back and you were milking it and you were scraping it. Would be a catalog where if you were milking a cow as it was getting cattle pronged with electric and the liquid on the prong had an interaction that meant it squeezed through into its udders would give an amount of acidity if that tree was getting tacked with a sack in it, and that was making a curse on the land be as though because it was that hazardous to touch or press upon, especially when sapping or tapping. On Nightmare on Elm Street, it was a curse of Freddy Krueger treating the whole place as it was burning in hell. And this is what things in the ground would be coming up if everything was welling off as a volcano's mouth. That infused with bags collecting wetland. How much moss interferes with it is a spectrum within a cotton ball that was the size of the entire town, but it was invisible and made out of air. What dimension do you think it would encapsulate within your body's manifold? You cover up a stick with foam and then enforce action on it, it would be equal to having a whole bunch of conductivity represent a harmonic formation of colors from the tension of the glass being darker if it was closer.
You can find any of those on any of these receipts.
The more air is calculated to a brighter color or more burning of a metal. These people, and some of them buried all their money underground. And that's what the pharaoh did underground inside of the gold stuff. He just put the most gold reserves are in Russia. China has a whole bunch of gold. Can be defined. This would hurt me. Telecommunication. And when a cattle prong is used on a cow, it was this color. And if that color meant it was that acidic. The difference between that color and like a frog's skin, if it's like really poisonous, is an amount of secretion if it was putting it on its back and you were milking it and you were scraping its back. So frogs that are poisonous, if it has it on its back, that would be a catalog where if you were milking a cow as it was getting cattle pronged with electric and the liquid on the prong had an interaction that meant it squeezed through into its udders would give an amount of acidity if that tree was getting tacked with a sack in it, and that was making a curse on the land be as though because it was that hazardous to touch or press upon, especially when sapping or tapping. That But if you're tapping trees that had algae on it and the algae was so like poisonous that there's like a residual effect, if you got within 5 feet of it, the air that would be coming off of the moss within 5 feet of it would be taking you out. Especially if you touched it, then it would be equal to like a high rate, like 30 miles per hour breaking of a structure of any component. Devoid of time. was equal to like whatever tree tappings were with like the amount of trees that pass by. If all these can be placements of this decomposing time, so you wouldn't have that as a variable, was equal to the compression of plastic put over wedges. If the amount of rain that perspirates from the difference of whatever fog was out prior to it, how much of air represented as a fluid is the amount of liquidation that is surmounted throughout your vacuum system, your two lungs, and how much of that, if you're outside for an hour, is it within a box of a whole bunch of cotton-like fabric that is air. If you had a cotton ball and you had its antimatter cotton ball, this is a thing that is like it, except different in charge. Disappear as in thin air, but still have the same replication, imitation of it, because it's its anti. In the moment of annihilation is when they would touch, and if they were touching on top of each other exactly, that is what general relativity says can't happen. But for annihilation particles, if there's a symmetry where it's like a giant war and they all touch on each other at the same time, it could mimic something that of which air is versus cotton fibers. And that's the difference, an exact moment of a representation of how much water is in air. If air were cotton and I was breathing cotton ball all around me and dissipated it, and then that annihilation of dissipation could fill up an amount of a swimming pool. If I breathed in so much fog that it were just that much water to fill up a swimming pool, it would best be represented as cotton all around me. And right now this air is really thick, so it would be actual cotton ball all around you, even though it would be stretched out, because this fog isn't that thick if you're in the middle of it. And that's why you can see around you in fog, even though it's really dense around you. You can't see it initially because it's too thin, but lo and behold, all around you it's that same consistency, isn't it? How is a dragon heart like a 4-stroke engine? It's a repression system, and so it's like a vacuum where it needs sealant in order for it to be extravated outwardly. What this could mean is, instead of fluid, a vacuum uses air. So a pump of a heart valve, instead of air, it uses fluid. The fluid, however, is very much intricate of air, because inside hemoglobin, that's oxygen, and there's 4 globins inside of a heme bound. Having an ending feature represent a coating inside chemically of nodes. These nodes are proteins that send out 2 strips. These 2 strips are like a ladder that has been cut and twisted. The cut and twisted method with globin allows for oxygen to be almost half as much air type within the liquid of what a pump of a heart is doing. And that's how a 4-stroke engine repression is just like the air pressure of a vacuum. And a stoke engine is like a heart, because they're very much alike in tension. Color. Time. That thing's a skater. Ain't this a great way to get the jakes? So the more I twirl in the air like an ice skater, if it's fog all around and it combusted really quickly, I'd be scraping in, if I had swords in my hands, a specific diode inside of a crystal-like structure, mainly if it all froze in the air like nitrous does in the air if it's let out of a CO2 canister. But instead of the canister getting loose, if it was just the sword blades inside of the air, because it was that combustible of the kinematics of what an annihilation particle would be if I had the blades of an annihilation particle within all the air combusting into water at the same time within the space that I was just jumping through. A Fourier transformation changes the decomposition of a function. This has been happening since two birds with one stone.